Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Dr. Williams, and this is the Race and Ethnicity Conference, and so I'm glad you could make it. You are able to ask questions. There are microphones that are up front, and so we'll make sure that you have access and you'll be able to ask those questions. Today, we're going to talk about wealth and income inequality. And unfortunately, things are getting worse and they're not actually getting better. So we're going to see exactly where we are within our society. And this is going to affect a lot of you as well. Even though I'm going to talk about race and ethnicity issues, many of you are going to be affected by this presentation, at least in terms of the outcome. So let me go ahead and get started. First of all, today what we're going to deal with is wealth inequality. We're going to define that. We're also going to define income inequality as well. We're going to look at the comparison between wealth and income inequality and who is actually affected. We're going to look at some of the possible causes of wealth and income inequality, as well as the results. And then hopefully I'm going to offer some ideas for change. And hopefully you, as a student or community person or whatever, to change your approach in terms of education as well as in terms of your life. There is a presentation I want you to watch, first of all, and it's only about 6 minutes, so just pay close attention to this.
There's a chart I saw recently that I can't get out of my head. A Harvard business professor and economist asked more than 5,000.
By the way, this is in the public domain, so you can see this for yourself. I just want to make sure that you know. You can Google this by just going to wealth inequality and videos, and it'll pop up. So you'll be able to see this on your own as well. Hopefully they'll actually record this.
5,000 Americans, how they thought wealth was distributed in the United States. This is what they said they thought it was. Dividing the country into 5 rough groups of the top, bottom, and middle 3 20% groups, they asked people how they thought the wealth in this country was divided. Then he asked them what they thought was the ideal distribution. And 92%, that's at least 9 out of 10 of them, said it should be more like this. In other words, more equitable than they think it is. Now that fact is telling, admittedly, the notion that most Americans know that the system is already skewed unfairly. But what's most interesting to me is the reality compared to our perception. The ideal is as far removed from our perception of reality as the actual distribution is from what we think exists in this country. So ignore the ideal for a moment. Here's what we think it is again. And here is the actual distribution, shockingly skewed. Not only do the bottom 20% and the next 20%, the bottom 40% of Americans barely have any of the wealth. I mean, it's hard to even see them on the chart. But the top 1% has more of the country's wealth than 9 out of 10 Americans believe the entire top 20% should have. Mind-blowing. But let's look at it another way, because I find this chart kind of difficult to wrap my head around. Instead, let's reduce the 311 million Americans to just a representative 100 people. Make it simple. Here they are: teachers, coaches, firefighters, construction workers, engineers, doctors, lawyers, some investment bankers, a CEO, maybe a celebrity or two. Now let's line them up according to their wealth. Poorest people on the left, wealthiest on the right. Just a steady row of folks based on their net worth. We'll color code them like we did before based on which 20% quintile they fall into. Now let's reduce the total wealth of the United States, which was roughly $54 trillion in 2009, to this symbolic pile of cash. And let's distribute it among our 100 Americans. Well, here's socialism, all the wealth of the country distributed equally. We all know that won't work. We need to encourage people to work and work hard to achieve that good old American dream and keep our country moving forward. So, here's that ideal we asked everyone about. Something like this curve. This isn't too bad. We've got some incentive, as the wealthiest folks are now about 10 to 20 times better off than the poorest Americans. But hey, even the poor folks aren't actually poor, since the poverty line has stayed almost entirely off the chart. We have a super healthy middle class with a smooth transition into wealth. And yes, Republicans and Democrats alike chose this curve. 9 out of 10 people, 92%, said this was a nice, ideal distribution of America's wealth. But let's move on. This is what people think America's wealth distribution actually looks like. Not as equitable, clearly, but for me, even this still looks pretty great. Yes, the poorest 20 to 30% are starting to suffer quite a lot compared to the ideal, and the middle class is certainly struggling more than they were, while the rich and wealthy are making roughly 100 times that of the poorest Americans and about 10 times that of the still healthy middle class. Sadly, this isn't even close to the reality. Here is the actual distribution of wealth in America. The poorest Americans don't even register. They're down to pocket change, and the middle class is barely distinguishable from the poor. In fact, even the rich between the top 10 and 20 percentile are worse off. Only the top 10% are better off. And how much better off? So much better off that the top 2 to 5% are actually off the chart at this scale. And the top 1%, this guy, well, his stack of money stretches 10 times higher than we can show. Here's his stack of cash, restacked, all by itself. This is the top 1% we've been hearing so much about. So much green in his pockets that I have to give him a whole new column of his own because he won't fit on my chart. 1% of America has 40% of all the nation's wealth. The bottom 80%, 8 out of every 10 people, or 80 out of these 100, only has 7% between them. And this has only gotten worse in the last 20 to 30 years. While the richest 1% take home almost a quarter of the national income today, in 1976, they took home only 9%, meaning their share of income has nearly tripled in the last 30 years. The top 1% own half the country's stocks, bonds, and mutual funds. The bottom 50% of Americans own only 0.5% of these investments, which means they aren't investing. They're just scraping by. I'm sure many of these wealthy people have worked very hard for their money, but do you really believe that the CEO is working 380 times harder than his average employee? Not his lowest paid employee, not the janitor, but the average earner in his company. The average worker needs to work more than a month to earn what the CEO makes in 1 hour. We certainly don't have to go all the way to socialism to find something that is fair for hardworking Americans. We don't even have to achieve what most of us consider might be ideal. All we need to do is wake up and realize that the reality in this country is not at all what we think it is.
It's pretty telling in terms of what's going on within the society today. So let me give you some definitions and talk about wealth inequality, income inequality, and then I'll give you an opportunity to ask questions at the very end. First of all, wealth inequality refers to the unequal distribution of assets within the society. This, in fact, has gotten so bad that it is actually higher than it's actually been since 1928. That means that the average student, for example, the individuals going to college is going to have more debt in terms of being able to get that education. But even after you get the education and even after you pay the debt, in terms of your actual wealth or your ability to actually accumulate wealth is not going to be very much better than it is now prior to you actually having your degree, regardless of whether it is a bachelor's, master's, or a doctoral degree. We equate wealth with net worth, and so net worth is going to be anything that you have or have been able to accumulate minus whatever it is that you have to pay for or pay out, minus the liabilities. Assets can be your house, can be your car, can be cash savings, bonds, stocks, whatever you own. The liabilities are going to be the things that you have to pay for: car loans, credit card balances, student loan, your mortgage, or any other bills that have to be paid. It might even be a cell phone that has to be paid. In the United States, wealth inequality runs even more pronounced than income inequality, and there is, in fact, a large gap even in terms of income inequality. This just shows you here, in terms of this distribution, that about 54% of the wealth is actually owned by the richest 3% of the families within the United States. And that's huge. Notice the bottom 90%. The 25% is by the 90% at the very bottom. So the top 10% have almost 75 or a little over 75% or 3/4 of the income within this particular, within our society. So what you're seeing is that the gap is just getting worse. They've said for years, go to school, get an education, you're going to get a good job, therefore you'll be able to move into the middle class with the possibility of being able to move into the upper class. But looking at the distribution, it just shows you that it's less likely for you to be able to move into the middle class, or even being able to move into the upper class as well. In terms of the ownership of financial assets, it's about 85%, somewhere in that area, in terms of the top 10% of the financial assets, at least up until about 2013. And what we've seen thus far is that actually it's getting worse, and it's not actually getting better. So what you need to know is that if you happen to be a minority group member, it's even worse. This is talking primarily about the society as a whole. So if you are a member of the minority group, that's African Americans, Hispanics, Native Americans, whatever group you belong to, that actually it's getting worse. For this, in terms of this particular chart, it refers to how in 1983, African Americans' wealth, whites' wealth was about 8 times that of African Americans' wealth. It was up to 17 times in 1989, but in 2013, we're seeing that the wealth for white households compared to African American households is 13 times greater for white households than it is for African American households. So you can see that there is a wide distribution in terms of the gaps between income and wealth as well. Income inequality is defined as the unequal distribution of income that's depending upon what group you actually belong to. So the different participants in the economy. Typically, we look at it as a percentage of the income in terms of the total population. Now, the income inequality is also quite glaring as well. 1/4 of American workers make less than $10 per hour. $10 per hour. In fact, that's not even a living wage for many people. For even if you're looking at single individuals, $10 an hour means that actually you're not even at the point of the poverty line. So it's quite telling, in fact. It just shows you here what the poverty line is: $11,369 for a single individual, $17,590 for a family of 3, and $22,162 for a family of 4. And so that $10 per hour is not a living wage. Even if individuals are going to get the wage increase to $15 an hour, it will help, but it will not be able to get people out of poverty or be able to assist them in terms of the difficulties they might be having in terms of earning a living wage. The top 10% of earners took home 50% of all income in 2012, and that's the highest percent in the past 100 years when the government began collecting income data. Watch this. The top 10% of earners took home 50% of all income in 2012. And once again, that's the highest percentage in the past 100 years when the government began collecting income data. So the top 1% of earners took home over 20% of the income. That's huge. So in terms of getting ahead, it makes it more difficult for the rest of us to be able to make progress, even in terms of paying bills. Many of you probably work and have to go to school at the same time, just trying to get by. Whether you're a minority group member or not a minority group member, it still has an effect on you, whether you recognize it or not. In terms of the share of income, this is just a slide to help you understand that 22.5%, the top 1% families, excuse me, with incomes above $394,000 brought home 22.5% of the annual income of everybody else. 22.5%. 16.1%, that's the next 4%. Those are the people that make somewhere between $161,000 and $394,000, brought home 16.1% of the annual income. The bottom 90% are left. Those individuals that are below $114,000 brought home almost 50% of the income. So you can see the wide gap between the haves and the have-nots. And it's not getting any better. In terms of comparison, the wealthiest 160,000 families own as much wealth as the poorest 145 million families. So wealth is about 10 times as unequal as the income is. And the rich continue to use tax incentives, tax tricks, ways to minimize the amount of taxes that they actually pay. So the rich continue to pay less taxes than we actually pay. The tax rate, by the way, for the rich is about 18%, down from about 30% in 1995. So they're paying less and less in terms of taxes. The highest earning fifth of U.S. families earned about 59.1% of all income. The richest fifth held almost 90% of the wealth, and that's huge. So most of you, or many of you, whether you're a minority group member or not, probably do not have stocks and bonds. We know that the people at the very bottom tend not to have stocks and bonds. The Americans in the upper fifth of the income distribution, they earn 16.7 times as much as those in the lowest fifth, okay, according to the Pew Research Center's 2013 global survey. Half, or almost half, of Americans think the rich-poor gap is a very big problem. But that's, once again, not quite half, and it actually ought to be larger than that. So there's evidence suggesting that the inequality and other social problems are actually related. Drug use, drug abuse, etc., crime, all of those are actually related. Well, who's the most affected? Well, you find that there are large numbers of people that are actually affected. Whether people know it or not, they're actually affected. Whether you happen to be a minority group member or a non-minority group member, you are still affected. Just to show you the difference between whites and African Americans, the gap, the median income difference in 1967 was about $19,000. It's gone up to $27,000 in 2011. Once they corrected based upon 2012 dollars. The median African-American household income was 59% of the median white household, up modestly from 55% in 1967. But as recently as 2007, African-Americans' income was 63% of white income. So for minorities, it's bad. But it's also bad for whites as well, especially when you find yourself down below $114,000 per year. And there are a lot of people that are below $114,000 per year. So the gap has actually widened. The wealth gap between white and Hispanic households has also widened. And there are very similar numbers for Hispanics as well as it is for African Americans also. So once again, this is affecting a large percentage of the population. If you look at the graph, it shows that whites and Asians are going to be at the top. Whites and Asians are very close. Not a lot of difference between the two. A little over $1,000 difference in terms of the median adjusted household. But if you look at the difference between white and Asians and Hispanics and African Americans, you find that there is $27,000 to $28,000 difference between the two in terms of the median household income. And that's a huge difference. Huge difference. Well, what are the causes? There are a lot of problems in terms of why it occurs, under what reasons this actually comes about. Deregulation of the financial markets, energy, the airline industry, et cetera. Globalization, outsourcing of jobs. Technology has been a problem. The U.S. tax policy, the billionaire loophole, capital gains. Just for your information, capital gains is not taxed at the same rate that your income is taxed. It's actually taxed at a lower rate. So when people buy stocks and bonds, they are taxed at a much lower rate than you are when you work at whatever job it is that you actually work at. I remember watching an interview about Warren Buffett and him talking about how his secretary actually pays a higher rate of taxes than he does. And he's a billionaire, but she pays a higher percentage of taxes than he does. And she makes significantly less than he does. Other problems, the monetary policy, Federal Reserve decisions, the gold standard, an increase in CEO compensation with stock options. It's not market driven. Individuals get paid for being in the position, but it has nothing to do with how well the company does or how well the stock does or anything like that. There have been predatory lending issues, as well as this one, which will affect all of you, is going to be what? The increase in college tuition. Yes, and so even in 2015 fall, the tuition will go up again. So some of you will have to take out loans, some of you will have to do other things, work more hours, et cetera, to be able to pay for the tuition. The results in terms of wealth and income inequality and why you should care is because while the poor remain poor, it affects you. It increases the likelihood or probability that you will become a victim of crime yourself. Or you might actually find yourself being in a position where you actually wind up committing crime and not even knowing that you do it. For example, in this country, if you write a check and you're trying to beat the check in terms of getting back to your bank account, believe it or not, writing a check with no money in the account or even insufficient funds is actually a crime. Why does it come about? Because the poor do not have the money necessary, etc. Limited ability to save and or invest. Many of you probably do not have the ability to save or invest money because of the low pay and the high expenses that you might actually have from week to week, month to month. Lack of proper medical care. That means that individuals within the society ultimately, while we have Obamacare, Obamacare might help, but many times there are going to be high rates with the Obamacare. So actually what we need, and I'll talk about this later on, is a universal health care system. Other countries in the world actually have it. So not only do we have a lack of proper medical care, these individuals don't go to the hospital until it's absolutely necessary. And when they do go to the hospital, it costs even more because they typically can't afford a regular physician, so they have to go to the emergency room. And emergency room care is more expensive than going to see your regular physician. So that lack of proper medical care has an effect on shortened life expectancies. Therefore, the poor are more likely to die sooner. Those individuals that don't have the money to afford medical care. The educational opportunities are limited. So while you want to go to work on your master's, not only your bachelor's, but your master's, your doctorate, because of the cost of education, some of you will not be able to do that. I know people that are in debt over $200,000 working on their master's degree and have to pay that off, and you can't file bankruptcy on these loans, which creates a problem. The housing options are limited. There's decreased home ownership. People are more likely to live in low-income housing. A greater percentage of income spent on necessities, food, shelter, etc. So we have increased alcoholism, drug abuse, and other addictive behaviors, increased criminal activity, very little savings in terms of preparing for retirement, lack of a pension, 401k, 403b, etc. So therefore, individuals that are minority or poor are at the bottom. And the bottom line is that everyone, rich and poor, is negatively affected by this widening gap between the haves and the have-nots. Well, how do we change this? How do we go about changing this? One of the things that we can do is invest in education. Early childhood education is a plus. It helps all children across the spectrum. And we know that early education benefits last a lifetime if we can maintain it for all children, regardless of what group, race, color, creed that they actually belong to. There should be universal free education. President Obama has proposed that there be free community college tuition, which is a start, which is a good idea. There should be actually a more progressive tax code. The tax rates for those at the top has actually been declining, but we need to change that so that the rich pay a higher percentage of taxes and the people at the bottom or middle class actually pay less. But the data shows that ultimately the gap is actually widened and the top are actually seeing their tax rate decline, even though their income and wealth has increased significantly. So the data show that we have created bad tax policy by giving capital gains and special privileges in our country's tax code. I already told you that capital gains, you get paid in terms of the tax rate, less than on wages or on income, then this is actually outrageous, because a person buys stocks or bonds, they actually get to pay a lower tax rate than you and I because we actually work. Privileges that give investment income more value than actual work. So it causes people within the society to figure that, why should I work that hard when I'm really not valued as a worker? The people who buy stocks and bonds appear to be more valuable than you and I who are actually working. And it doesn't mean that the people at the top don't work, but it means that they must be more important, they must be more valuable in terms of what they do throughout the year than you and I are. Earned income credit. This is one of the things that we really need to do and make changes in. And the research shows that by increasing the earned income tax credit, we actually will benefit a large number of individuals that are poor or minority especially, and children for sure, to raise them above the poverty line on an annual basis. This would give them more support to the working poor, the individuals who have to deal with daycare. What do I do with my child when I go to work? It would also help individuals be able to save, to be able to invest, to be able to do other things in terms of their income. We need tax reform, which is a biggie. The capital gains should be the same as payroll and income taxes. No way that there should actually be a difference at all. And then Congress needs to close the tax loophole, the billionaire estate tax loophole. And I'll tell you how this works. The billionaire tax code, estate tax loophole, works this way. The people at the very top can take the bonds and stocks that are performing very well and give it to their children. By giving it to their children, they, in essence, don't have to pay taxes on that. So therefore, if the stock starts to do poorly, the billionaire can take those stocks back, okay? And therefore, they ultimately don't have to pay the taxes on that. So they get to play this shell game. They get to move the stocks and bonds around so that they can avoid paying taxes. And actually, this is really hurting us as a society as a whole. Another thing we need to do is we need to increase the minimum wage. Believe it or not, $10 an hour is not even going to be sufficient as a minimum wage. Minimum wage ought to be $15 to $20 per hour in terms of the minimum wage. We do know that it will help the society as a whole, and anytime you raise people at the bottom by raising them up, it raises everybody else up, because it means that they can spend more, they can save more, they can do more with their money for their family, etc. The next one is helping working families build assets. This is what we really ought to be doing, is to encourage people in terms of the savings rates. You ever notice how we get taxed? We get taxed on the income we make. We get taxed again for what we save, and then we're taxed again for whatever we buy. I believe here in Michigan, the governor's proposing an increase in terms of our sales tax so that we can fix our roads, et cetera. Well, who's going to pay the largest percentage of that? We are. The people that are going to be at the bottom or middle class. Who can least afford it? The people who are at the bottom or middle class. So it's going to be an unfair distribution at all. So we need to make sure that we help families build assets so they can once again save money, invest, do things like that. But the society does not seem like it's prepared for that. Another one is we ought to help working families with home ownership. Home ownership is probably one of the biggest things that most of you will be able to acquire in your lifetime, will be a home. And so we need to help people to be able to do that. The home interest mortgage deductions total approximately $80 billion, but 60% of this goes to people with income over $100,000. Yeah. So we need to make a change in that as well by helping working families make the necessary changes. We need to support economic and racial integration in neighborhoods. Why? Because we know that higher levels of racial segregation within an area, there is a high correlation in terms of upward mobility. So when people are more likely to live together and there's less segregation, we have upward mobility of all people, not just people that are poor, not just people that are minorities, but also people that need the assistance, need the help. So it raises everybody's boat. It doesn't just raise one group. We need to change public policy. We need to change our priorities in terms of voting for sure. And everybody ought to vote. And one of the things we know is that less than 50% of eligible voters actually vote even in presidential elections. It's one of the reasons that Republicans want you to stay home, Democrats want you to go to the polls. Because when you stay home, Republicans do better. When you vote, Republicans do worse. So there is a relationship here in terms of whether you vote or whether you don't vote. So we need to change the status quo for sure. We need to increase the low turnout. Once again, if you look at this, just to give you an idea of the numbers, I've already talked about it, but you look at the numbers, look at this, 41% of eligible voters making less than $15,000 a year, compared to 78% of those making $150,000 a year or more. There's a real skew in the distribution here, all right? So this difference in turnout affects public policy, all right? One of the reasons that people, politicians especially, are very concerned about the elderly is because it doesn't matter. The elderly vote in huge numbers. So they don't want to antagonize the elderly. So they make sure, wait a minute, they're going to go vote. Regardless of what their income level is, the elderly are much more likely to vote than younger people are in terms of voting. How do we go about making these changes? We got to change regulation as well, and the universal health care that I talked about as well, so that health care is available to everyone, not just to the people at the top. Obamacare, good start, but that's not sufficient. It needs to be greater than that. It needs to be so that every human being within the society has access to universal, free health care. Because we pay for it one way or the other. We're going to pay for it, no matter what. It's just like prisons. We have to pay for them. So it's going to affect you, it's going to affect me, it's going to affect everybody. It's just that there's a disproportionate effect on the poor or middle class than it is for those individuals that are going to be at the very top. This is what you need to do. You need to change your approach. First of all, do not look at college, university, as a means to a job. You need to think about being a business owner, an entrepreneur, and use education as a tool to assist you in that direction. Forget go to school, get a good education, get a good job. There are thousands of people with education that are unemployed. What else do you do? Stop taking out loans, student loans, car loans, personal loans, etc. Let me deal with the car loans. Now they're moving to 7- and 8-year car loans. That makes no sense. None. You're going to be paying for a car that the car does not have the value that you're paying for because you have a 7- or an 8-year loan. The most you should ever pay in terms of a loan is 36 months. If you can't afford the new car, buy a used car. Don't buy a new car. Stop viewing college as a means to a job. I've already talked about that one for sure. But let me go back for just a minute and talk about student loans. Pell Grant, fine. Don't take out the loans because you have to pay them back and you can't file bankruptcy on those loans. They follow you for the rest of your life. And in fact, because there are baby boomers who are starting to retire, many of those baby boomers are actually going to have their loans taken out of their Social Security. Yeah. So they just follow you, and you can't get rid of them. So don't take out loans. There are scholarships, there are grants, there are places for you to go to find money. Yes. Find a job that will help pay for your education. Make more informed decisions. Save more and spend less. In other words, live below your means. Do not live above your means. You don't have to have a new phone every time a new phone comes out. All right? You don't need the iPhone 6. Okay? All right? The old flip phone, believe it or not, still makes phone calls. Okay? So keep your flip phone. It's okay, all right? Now you say, yeah, but I can't text, okay? Well, you can buy an old Android or iPhone and still be able to text without buying the iPhone 6, okay? Whether you get the big one or the small one doesn't really matter. But save more and spend less. If you smoke, stop smoking. If you drink, stop drinking. It saves money. All those other things you might be doing. There's no need of me mentioning those here, but whatever else you might be doing, okay, stop doing that, all right? Save your money. Vote in every election. I don't care whether it's a local election, whatever it is, vote. Okay? It doesn't matter where it is. If it's your own local election, vote in the local election. Don't just vote for the presidential or in the presidential election. Vote. It makes a difference. Okay? It does make a difference for sure. You want to press your elected officials for desired reform. Stop relying on the government to implement solutions. You're going to have to make these changes yourself. Nobody's going to do it for you. And if they do it for you, it's going to cost you. So think about this. You can get a loan. They will give you the loan to go to school, but you got to pay it back. And it will take a huge chunk of your income to be able to pay that loan back. And it has an effect on your credit score, your credit report, etc. This is the last slide here that I want you to see. Pay attention to it. If the United States was divided up according to land, the top 1%, they would own this. The next 9% would own this. The 30% would own this. The 20% would own this. And then 40%, they would own the dot. I'm not even sure you can see the dot, but it's there. So you want to make sure that you don't fall into this trap as far as income inequality is concerned. You can buy stocks, you can buy mutual funds, you can buy bonds, other things that you can invest in. You can save, your money. You do not have to buy everything new. You can buy used, believe it or not. It does work. You have questions for me? Questions? Here you go, Tim. I turned it on already.
It sounds great to, well, first of all, it's just very disturbing to hear about. We didn't think it was that bad. I think we knew it was, but not that bad. But it looks obvious to me that that top 10% and that top 1% is not really concerned about how the rest of the country is doing, because they are actually having a huge impact on political policies to keep things the way that they are. Even though there's more of us and we're the greater percentage, we don't seem to have much impact on public policy. So how is anything going to change? That top 1%, 2%, 10%, they don't really want to give up their power. They want to maintain that power.
You're right. They do want to maintain that power, but they maintain the power because we allow them to maintain that power. One of the things that we could actually do is just by voting. I mean, every person in the society, if we voted every time that the polls opened, then the top 1% would be changed. The top 10% would be changed.
I agree somewhat with that, except that we don't always receive correct information on how to vote. You know, the media slants it one way or the other. You know, magazines will slant it one way or the other. So even to go out there and vote after we have read what we think we agree with and then vote in that way, after we find out, like Obamacare, for example, after you find out, after you read that huge document, it isn't at all what you thought it was going to be. So I don't think most of us are getting correct information to even vote in the right way.
Part of that is because we don't do the research. We do more research on buying a car or a refrigerator or a stove than we do in terms of voting. So when it comes to voting, we just flip pages and look at what's in the newspaper or magazine instead of doing the research on our own. And what we have to do as the citizens is, first of all, the first thing we need to do is stop thinking of college and university as a way to a job. That's one of the worst things we could ever do. After we change our mindset in terms of becoming owners or entrepreneurs, and you don't have to have a multi-million-dollar business in terms of making a living. You can do that without making $1 million a year. But once again, it's easier for us to go to college and go to university than to start your own business. And actually what you ought to do is say, you look at the university and college education as a means to educate you in preparing you to be a business owner or an entrepreneur. By voting every time? Yes. By changing the policies? Yes. By not being passive in terms of our society. And what we've done is we've taken the benefits that we have and actually said, okay, this is good enough. I don't really need to worry about anybody else because I'm making X amount of dollars. And well, let me give you another statistic. In order for you to be in the top 5% of the world, do you know how much money you have to make to be at that level? Top 5% of the world. And I'll give you a hint, it's not millions. No. To be in the top 5% of the world, that was a slide in terms of the United States. To be in the top 5% of the world, you need to make $100,000 per year or more. Just $100,000. And you're in the top 5% of the world. And even when you make $100,000 a year, that's not a lot of money. Think of it this way. $36,000 per year is $3,000 per month. And when you break it down into, that's before taxes, of course. And the government typically wants 1/3 of our taxes. So if they're going to take $12,000, we're down to $24,000. That's $2,000 per month. Rent is $650 a month, depending upon how large your family is. Okay? Maybe even more. So now we're down to about $1,350 per month. That's what's left. Throw in a car note, throw in school, books, etc. I keep trying to get my students, stop buying the paperback books. Forget that. Buy an e-book. It's a lot cheaper. Rent a book. Don't buy it and then sell it back to them. That makes no sense. I'm going to buy a brand new car for $10,000, trade it into them after 4 months, and they'll give me $5,000 for it. That makes no sense. So what we have to do is to make some changes in terms of how we think. And the rich think differently than we think. They think in terms of how can they maintain their wealth. And we're thinking about how do we keep up with the Joneses. Well, I want that new iPhone. Great. Can you afford it? No. Don't buy it. Flip phone works. Okay? You don't have to text everybody on the planet. You don't have to sit in class and text. You don't have to be walking down the street texting. You don't need to do all of that. You can call them. Believe it or not, it's cheaper. So we have to change our mental thoughts in terms of our wealth. It doesn't take a lot of money to buy mutual funds, $25 a month, mutual funds. Easy. Every paycheck, you ought to be saving a minimum of 10% out of your paycheck. I can't afford it. I can't. Well, but if you smoke, think of how much you pay for the cigarettes. I can't afford it, but you smoke. Hello. So what's happened is we are living in a society that says that we have the right to certain things. People that come to this country from other countries, they think of it as a privilege, while we're thinking about it as a right. So we've got to change how we think. We're not functioning properly. We're more concerned about today, but we're not thinking about when I'm 65. And most of you, I know, you have a long time until you become 65, or at least most of you, and if not all of you. But even so, when you get to 65, it hurts trying to work at a McDonald's drive-thru. It does. What if your health is poor? You can't afford to work at McDonald's. What do? There are people who do eat cat food, believe it or not, in this society because they can't afford regular, nutritious food. It is disturbing. That's why I wanted to show it. It's not to make you feel good, it's to make you think. Hopefully you will change your concepts in terms of money, in terms of wealth, etc. Drive a used car. Keep it for 10, 15 years. Fix it. I've got a question over here, and we'll come back to you. Yes, sir.
In the past, minority groups rallied together to kind of stand against big business and labor injustice. Do you think that the downfall of labor unions have played into this?
It has. And in fact, it's not only labor unions, but it's the right to work laws that have been passed in different places. And all of this is designed to weaken labor unions. And labor unions actually got us to the point of the 40-hour work week, paid vacations, sick time, all of that. And we're trying to minimize that. The other thing that the society has done, especially those at the top, is to divide and conquer. So now what we've done is we use race as a means to separate people. I'm different than you are based upon race. So therefore, our goals are not the same. They are the same. But they put out the propaganda that we're somehow very different. We're not. You want your children to be successful? I want my children to be successful. You want a good life? I want a good life. Okay? That idea of the American dream and the white picket fence and all of that, you can forget those days. All right? People that came out of the South, especially African Americans, moved out of the South, came up north. It was unheard of when Henry Ford started paying $5 a day for work. That was unheard of. And so from that point forward, people started to increase. And after World War II, there was an increase in terms of the middle class. Even the poor were able to move up after that time because of industrialization. Globalization, because we have outsourced many jobs, et cetera. So union numbers have declined. Membership has declined. And a lot of people say we don't need unions. Do away with the unions and you'll see what will happen. It'll get actually worse. So yeah, you're exactly right as far as that's concerned. Somebody else had a question. I'm sorry.
Do you think by increasing minimum wage to the $15 an hour is going to increase the cost of living for everybody? So I'm curious how that will fix it.
No, it won't. And in fact, by increasing the minimum wage to $10 to $15 an hour, you'll do a number of things. One, you'll make it possible for the people that are making that $15 an hour to be able to afford some of the products that the rich actually produce. The reason that prices continue to go up is not because of the wages. It goes up because the people at the top want a certain amount of return on their money, and they're not willing to decrease the amount of the return. And part of that is because we play into the game. So when Apple says, I've got an iPhone 6 that's coming out, we line up in huge numbers to buy it. It's not made in this country, it's made in China. So where are we sending the money? Not here. Huh? So when we did NAFTA with Mexico, that hurt us. A lot of companies have since found out, wait a minute, we got a problem, so they've had to bring those jobs back here, and now they've outsourced it to to other countries, so to India, to Malaysia, to Thailand, et cetera. So the $15 an hour really should not be the goal. The living wage should be the goal. How many children do you have? How many are in your family? And will $15 per hour feed your family? If it won't, that's not good enough. Then you don't raise it to 15, you raise it to 20. The costs, once again, are related to how much the top 1%, the top 10% believes that they should be able to earn. So it's really about greed is what it's really about. And since we don't say much about it, then it goes unchecked. And so nobody says anything, and it's like, oh, okay, all right. Until you get through with your education. For many of you, because of your ages, you don't know what's coming yet. You're not there. A family of 3 trying to live on $30,000 a year, you're in trouble. You're in serious trouble. And it looks great now, and you look at it as, I want to be a whatever, and whatever degree you've chosen in terms of whatever your area is. The starting wages are not going to be the kind of income that you're really going to need to take care of you and your family. If you're going to be single for the rest of your life, that's one thing. If you're going to get married, have children, and some of you do, it costs. So the $15 an hour might not be sufficient for some people, but it's the starting point. It's like Obamacare. Obamacare is not perfect. It's not, but it's a start. Yes, ma'am.
Just a quick statement. You said something earlier about how today's students and just our generation period should look beyond a higher education as a guarantee to a job, and I totally agree. Recently being out in the workforce, having a family, the mortgage and all that stuff, student loans, all that. But one thing I do believe is that if people are going to seek a higher education, they have to do it for personal reasons. Because there are benefits to it, education, of course.
Oh, there are.
And there's some positions that even if they aren't an entrepreneur, that they will never be able to seek if they do not have those particular degrees. So I think people have to keep things not only in perspective, but also you made also a great point when you said, you know, the iPhone 6, the Android, whatever, how to live within your means if you're not going to be that entrepreneur, if you're not going to be making, like you said, we're the bottom, the majority of us are the bottom 50%. That's how it is. That's how it probably will be in a long time. I think that's something that we aren't taught as a people. We don't know what living within our means. What does $30,000 look like? And it doesn't have to be dirt poor. What does $50,000 look like? It doesn't have to be eating cat food. What does living $60,000 mean a year? What kind of car does that look like? What kind of phone does that look like? I think that's one issue that we aren't getting when we're in these educational fields and higher degrees, that what's the reality of what we may, prospectively get in our future.
I agree. I think education is worthwhile. I don't deny that at all. But our educational system has really failed us as a society. It's great to think of in terms of going to school and you get an education and you're going to make X amount of dollars. But like I said, let's say you start out at $36,000 a year, all right? And that's just a base number. Well, if the government takes a third of that, okay, or $12,000 per year, whether it's federal, state, city, et cetera, however it comes out, that leaves you $24,000 a year. That's not a lot of money. Can you live within $24,000? Yes, you can, but you're gonna have to live in a box. It's not, seriously, I'm not trying to make a joke of it, but I want you to understand, it's more dire than we really think. And then on that job, are you going to be able to get to the point where you can actually make $100,000 a year? 50 cents an hour increase in wages will not get you there. So you're right, education does pay. The problem is because of the cost of living within our society, that you've got to look at how it's offset in terms of what you earn versus what you have to pay out. One of the highest grossing Myers in Michigan, Grand Rapids especially, is 28th and Kalamazoo. Well, why? Because the poor and minorities spend a greater percentage of their income on food. That's just the food part. We haven't even gotten to the shelter part. Well, you know, I can always get Section 8. Sure you can, and maybe in about 10 years, because the list is so long that, do you see where I'm going? So by the time you get Section 8, okay, you might be 65. I don't know. But it's really designed to try to show you that the problems within our society are worse, but you can do something about it. You can stop being a victim and start taking control of your own life. Buy the flip phone. Forget Apple. You don't need to increase their stock prices. Stop doing that. Well, I've got to be able to text. Okay, let's say you do. Then buy an old phone that still texts. You don't have to buy a brand new one. I don't need everybody asking me, what phone do you have? Well, I've got this. Oh, man, I got to get one of those. Why? You don't need to do that. But we don't think that way in terms of long term. We have to learn how to vote every time the polls open. And really, it's a mindset. Because every penny you spend, every nickel, every dime, every quarter, you're really voting whether you know it or not. If I don't go to a restaurant and I tell every one of you that this is a bad restaurant and you don't go, what will happen with that restaurant? It'll close. So every time you spend your money, you're telling people, I approve of what you're doing. So you have to be careful about the dollars and the cents that you actually receive every payday. Once again, 10% of your wages, if you are working, should go towards savings. Every time you get paid, I don't care what the paycheck is, 10% ought to be in savings. You have other questions? I hope I answered your question. Any other questions? None? Well, thank you for coming. Oh, there's one back there in the back. I'm sorry.
Yes, this is about the minimum wage that you were talking about, and
Yes.
small business owners that
Yes.
are like depending on the minimum wage to pay their workers. And let's say it goes up, and then they jack up their prices, like the small business owners, are like, how would they handle that?
How, in terms of the offset?
Yeah.
Well, most of the small businesses that you're talking about, let's say you increase the minimum wage from $10 an hour to, let's say, $15 per hour. And the minimum wage is not $10 an hour. Minimum wage is actually 7-something an hour. But let's say we go to $15 an hour, and so we double it in terms of minimum wage. Are they going to have to increase their prices? Yes. But even if they increase their prices, at $15 an hour, they do not have to increase the wages or the prices twice as high in terms of being able to make a profit. So in other words, let's say you go from $7.50 to $15 an hour. In order for them to stay profitable, they only have to raise their percentage by a small percentage in terms of the increase in price. They don't have to increase the prices twice as much. Do you see where I'm going? So they're still going to benefit. The other thing is their workers will be able to buy their products that they're actually selling. Unfortunately, a lot of people that make the $7.50 an hour can't afford to buy the products that the small business owner is producing. So what you're doing is, if you raise the boat for the people at the bottom, you raise the boat for everybody. And that's what you really want to do. The other thing that has to happen is the people that have the income, first of all, should pay more tax, okay, in terms of percentages, not the 18% that they're paying today, but the 30% that they were paying in 1995, okay, at least 30%. Capital gains and payroll taxes or income taxes should be the same in terms of the same rate. And that would bring about the change. Then when the rich shrink the amount of the income that they're actually going to receive, they're actually going to make even more money when you raise the boat for everybody, because then other people can afford. I'll give you a good example. Walmart workers, and I don't know if any of you work at Walmart, but Walmart workers don't get paid a lot of money at all. But we're talking about one of the largest retailers in the world. And yet they can't afford to pay their workers a living wage. Something's wrong. And even if you look at it across the board with all workers, it's still poor. By the way, in Germany, I believe it's Germany, Walmart in Germany, they make more money than people in this country working for the same company. Why? Because they have rules in Germany that say that you must pay your workers a living wage. And we don't have that in this country. So once again, by raising the boat of the poor or the middle class, you actually raise everybody's boat, including the rich or the haves. Other questions? Anything else? No? Well, thank you for coming. I sure appreciate it. Hopefully you learned something and got something out of it. Hopefully it wasn't too disturbing, but it'll hopefully make you change in terms of the way you think. All righty, have a great day.